What would have happened if the United States had chosen not to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? This question has sparked decades of debate among historians, scientists, and ethicists. By mid-1945, with Nazi Germany defeated and only Imperial Japan still fighting, the U.S. faced a critical decision. The successful Trinity test on July 16th proved that the Manhattan Project had delivered the ultimate weapon, a device capable of unleashing destruction on a scale the world had never seen. American leaders suddenly found themselves holding a terrifying power in their hands. Was it necessary to use it to force Japan into surrender? Or could a demonstration of this new weapon's potential, perhaps detonated above a deserted area, be enough to pressure the Japanese government into giving up without causing mass civilian casualties? On July 17th, one day after the Trinity test, physicist Leo Szilard, who had conceived of nuclear chain reactions over a decade earlier, drafted a petition to President Harry S. Truman. It was signed by 70 Manhattan Project scientists, urging the U.S. to issue a final warning to Japan, giving them a chance to surrender under Allied terms before deploying such devastating weapons. They reminded Truman that the Manhattan Project had originally been justified as a defensive measure against a potential German nuclear attack, a threat that no longer existed. They feared that using atomic bombs would damage the United States' moral standing globally and open the door to a future of unchecked nuclear violence. But Szilard's plea never reached the president. Instead, it was handed to James F. Burns, who was about to become Secretary of State and a staunch supporter of using the bomb to end the war. Burns dismissed the petition outright, ensuring it never reached Truman's desk. Worse yet, General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, ordered an investigation into Szilard himself, seeking any grounds to discredit or prosecute him. Meanwhile, Secretary of War Henry Stimson formed a special advisory committee of 8 members to counsel the president on how to use the bomb. This committee then consulted a smaller group of Manhattan Project scientists, including Robert Oppenheimer, to gather technical and ethical perspectives. The resulting June 16th report revealed a sharp divide. Some scientists pushed for a technical demonstration to warn Japan and possibly avoid direct use against civilians, while others argued that a swift military application would save countless American lives and cement America's dominance in the post-war world. The majority leaned toward immediate use. The committee followed up with a recommendation on June 21st that the bomb be used as soon as possible, without warning, and against a military target surrounded by civilian structures, a strategic choice meant to amplify psychological shock. On August 6, 1945, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima transformed a vibrant city of 255,000 into a charred wasteland. Some 70,000 people died instantly, many vaporized or burned alive. Tens of thousands more would succumb to radiation and injury in the days and months that followed. As we revisit this sobering chapter of history, we're reminded of the importance of understanding the past, not to judge, but to learn. Our channel is committed to exploring these critical moments with depth and respect. If you find value in this kind of storytelling, consider helping us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers by June 30th. Every single subscription brings us closer to making more thoughtful content like this. Just 3 days later, on August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. The devastation was equally horrific. More than 40,000 people were killed immediately, with the death toll eventually surpassing 200,000 when including the long-term effects of radiation exposure. The vast majority of victims in both cities were civilians. On August 15th, 6 days after the Nagasaki bombing, the Empire of Japan announced its unconditional surrender. Among those advising Truman was Carl T. Compton, a prominent physicist and then president of MIT. A year later, in December 1946, He published a reflective article in The Atlantic explaining the reasoning behind his support for using the bomb. He acknowledged that, with the benefit of hindsight, one might argue Japan was already on the verge of defeat. Still, he maintained that those in command at the time had no guarantee of such an outcome. Compton had first-hand exposure to military assessments and strategy meetings in the Pacific and later spent a month in Japan immediately following VJ Day. Based on his experience, he strongly believed that the use of atomic bombs ultimately spared hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of lives on both sides. The invasion plans, in his view, would have resulted in far greater bloodshed than the bombings caused. Compton's position wasn't unique to American leadership. British officials also expressed support for the atomic bombings. On July 4, 1945, a month before the attacks, during a Joint Policy Committee meeting in Washington, British representatives gave their backing to the U.S. plan. But this leads to a deeper question. Was there truly no alternative to bombing civilian populations? Did Allied leaders offer Japan any real opportunity to surrender? On July 26, President Truman, along with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek, issued the Potsdam Declaration. It outlined terms for Japan's surrender and warned of prompt and utter destruction if they refused. However, the declaration made no mention of the atomic bomb, though the U.S. already had one ready. This absence left room for ambiguity. Japan's military leaders, particularly War Minister Koichika Anami and General Yoshijiro Umezu, considered the terms dishonorable and rejected the declaration. While some in the Japanese leadership, including Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, were inclined to accept the terms, internal divisions stalled any unified response. Their hopes rested on persuading the Soviet Union, still neutral at the time, to mediate a more favorable peace. However, unknown to them, the Allies had already cracked Japanese diplomatic codes and were fully aware of these hopes. Despite some internal openness to surrender, hardliners held enough power to block progress, at least until the bombings forced their hand. On July 28, in response to the Potsdam Declaration, Prime Minister Suzuki used the word mokusatsu in a press statement, a term that later became the subject of controversy and misunderstanding. Mokusatsu can mean either to ignore with silent contempt or to withhold comment, depending on context. While later myths suggested a mistranslation led the U.S. to assume Japan had outright rejected the declaration, the truth is more direct. In the full statement published in Japanese newspapers, Suzuki made it clear that Japan intended to continue fighting. The Imperial Press Agency translated his response as, "The Japanese government ignores the declaration, and we are determined to fight to the end." The Americans, aware of internal disagreements within Japan's leadership, could only guess at the true weight of pro-surrender voices. But with no tangible sign of capitulation, the U.S. moved forward with its plan. On August 6th, Hiroshima was obliterated. President Truman, in a speech delivered shortly afterward, warned that unless Japan accepted the terms, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Yet even after this horrific warning, Japanese government leaders vowed to continue the war. At this point, many wonder, why didn't the Japanese people revolt against their leaders? If they sensed the war was lost and that the U.S. possessed weapons capable of wiping out entire cities, why not rise up? The answer lies in Japan's internal information controls. During the final days of the war, the Japanese public had very limited understanding of what was happening. News was heavily censored, and the details of Hiroshima's destruction were not widely known. Only those in surrounding areas had a vague sense that something catastrophic had occurred, but they didn't grasp the scale. Even the translated version of the Potsdam Declaration, distributed in limited form inside Japan, omitted critical phrases like prompt and utter destruction. Though American planes dropped over 3 million leaflets across the country with the full declaration, Few civilians likely read or believed them. Reading enemy propaganda or tuning in to foreign broadcasts was strictly forbidden and punishable by imprisonment. The last hope for a mediated surrender, Soviet intervention, evaporated on August 8th, when Stalin declared war on Japan and initiated an assault on Manchuria. That same day, Soviet forces launched a massive three-front offensive into Japanese-occupied territory in Northeast Asia. The timing was devastating for Japan. Just hours after this declaration, the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. The compounded psychological and strategic shock created by these two seismic events finally pushed the Japanese government toward surrender. Yet even then, they attempted to negotiate one condition: preserving the emperor's role as the symbolic head of state. The Allies' response, drafted by U.S. Secretary of State James Burns, clarified that Hirohito's authority would be subject to the occupying forces and any future changes would be determined by the Japanese people themselves. Emperor Hirohito, who had remained mostly silent throughout the war, now faced a monumental decision. On August 15, 1945, at noon, his voice was broadcast over the radio, the first time the Japanese people had ever heard their emperor speak. In a solemn and indirect tone, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, citing the devastating power of a new and most cruel bomb that had taken so many innocent lives. He warned that continuing the war would not only lead to the collapse of the Japanese nation, but might also bring about the complete extinction of human civilization. Just days earlier, on the night of August 12th, a group of military officers led by Major Kenji Hatanaka attempted a coup to stop the surrender. They seized the imperial palace in a desperate bid to prevent the emperor's message from being broadcast, hoping to prolong the war. However, their efforts were thwarted. They failed to gain the support of senior military leadership, many of whom finally understood that further resistance was futile. With the coup crushed and Hirohito's speech aired nationwide, the war officially came to a close. On August 28th, Allied forces began their occupation of Japan. Less than a week later, on September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri anchored in the Tokyo Bay, Japan signed the formal instrument of surrender. The document marked not just the end of World War II, but the beginning of a new era for Japan, one defined by occupation, reconstruction, and reckoning. Yet a haunting question lingers. Would the war have ended the same way without the atomic bombings? Most historians agree Japan would have eventually been defeated. The question is not whether, but when, and at what cost. Though Japan had expanded rapidly during the early years of the war, its momentum had been broken by mid-1942. The pivotal Battle of Midway had turned the tide in the Pacific, and from then on, the Allies pushed relentlessly toward the Japanese homeland. By early 1945, the U.S. had captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa, two fiercely defended islands. The battle for Iwo Jima cost over 30,000 American casualties, while Okinawa added another 20,000 dead or missing. With Japan's home islands now within reach, Allied commanders braced for what they believed would be a final, brutal campaign. Military planners estimated that a full-scale invasion of Japan could result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and possibly millions of Japanese deaths. Japan's logistics were unraveling. Its economy was collapsing. Its merchant fleet was decimated by Allied submarines, and a crippling fuel shortage paralyzed its military operations. Still, Japanese commanders prepared for a last stand. Their strategy was to inflict such catastrophic losses on American forces during an invasion that the U.S. might be forced to negotiate peace terms rather than demand unconditional surrender. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, many Japanese leaders remained committed to fighting to the bitter end. This fierce resolve was evident in Japan's final military plan, known as Operation Ketsu-go. Unlike their previous strategies in battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where they allowed U.S. forces to land and then engage them inland, the Japanese now planned to confront the invaders immediately at the shoreline. The intention was to unleash overwhelming force at the beaches, hoping to repel or devastate the landing troops before they could gain a foothold. The plan included launching over 3,000 kamikaze attacks targeting transport ships and landing craft, alongside 5,000 suicide speedboats known as Shinyo, and every remaining destroyer and submarine. It was a strategy born of desperation, relying heavily on sacrifice. They even circulated the idea that every citizen, including women and children, should be prepared to fight and die in defense of the homeland. The slogan, 100 million die together, became a symbol of this mentality, even though Japan's population was actually around 72 million. General MacArthur's team, preparing for an invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November burst, estimated 50,000 U.S. casualties just in establishing a beachhead, and that was only the beginning. A prolonged, grinding conflict would have followed, likely, lasting many more months and resulting in unimaginable bloodshed on both sides. In this light, proponents of the bombings argued that they had shortened the war dramatically, saving countless lives that would have been lost in an extended conventional invasion. Still, critics argue that this line of reasoning simplifies a deeply complex moral issue. Could Japan have been forced to surrender through non-nuclear means? Some believe that a continued naval blockade, coupled with Soviet entry into the war and intensified conventional bombing, might have compelled Japan to surrender without the need for atomic weapons. Indeed, Japan was on the verge of collapse. Its cities lay in ruins from relentless firebombing campaigns, and its military lacked the resources to sustain prolonged conflict. Furthermore, diplomatic overtures through neutral nations suggested that Japan might have been willing to surrender if allowed to retain the emperor. Yet the Allies, insisting on unconditional surrender, rejected any such terms. Ironically, after the bombings and Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, the U.S. did allow Emperor Hirohito to remain as a symbolic figurehead, a concession they had previously refused. This has led many to question whether the bombings were truly necessary to end the war or whether they served other purposes, such as demonstrating American power to the Soviet Union. Historian Gar Alperovitz and others have argued that the decision to drop the bombs was influenced as much by geopolitical strategy as by military necessity. The rapid succession of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they claim, was meant to send a clear message to Moscow. The United States had not only developed nuclear weapons, but was willing to use them decisively. This is the kind of complexity that rarely fits into a single answer. And if you appreciate this type of nuanced perspective, history told without shortcuts, we'd love for you to like this video and follow our channel. It lets us know that these stories matter and encourages us to keep digging deeper. Adding another layer to the debate is the fact that the U.S. had additional bombs in production. Historians believe that had Japan not surrendered after Nagasaki, a third atomic bomb, possibly ready by August 19th, would have targeted Tokyo. The aim may have been to eliminate Japan's command structure or strike at the symbolic heart of the nation. Yet this plan was never set in motion. The Japanese government, shaken by the dual blows of atomic devastation and Soviet invasion, finally submitted to Allied terms. Interestingly, not all the decision-makers understood how limited the U.S. nuclear arsenal actually was. According to post-war records, Japanese War Minister Korechika Anami claimed that an American prisoner, a B-29 pilot named Marcus McDilda, had confessed under torture that the U.S. possessed 100 atomic bombs and planned to drop them on major cities like Tokyo and Kyoto. McDilda, in truth, knew nothing of the Manhattan Project. He invented the claim in desperation, hoping to avoid further torture. Ironically, his false statement may have helped convince Japan's leadership that surrender was the only viable option. The psychological impact of seeing two cities destroyed in a matter of days was overwhelming, and if the Americans truly had an arsenal of hundreds of such bombs, continuing the war would mean national suicide. Whether or not U.S. officials intended it, this combination of force and fear proved decisive. The choice of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as targets also invites scrutiny. Neither was Japan's largest city nor its most important industrial hub, but both were carefully selected for strategic and psychological reasons. Hiroshima was home to a major military command center and had a dense urban core, ideal for measuring the destructive effects of a nuclear bomb. Its surrounding hills would contain the blast, maximizing devastation. It also had not been heavily bombed previously, which allowed a clearer assessment of the atomic bomb's power. Nagasaki, on the other hand, was a secondary target. The original plan had been to strike Kokura, which housed munitions factories and military facilities. However, on the morning of August 9th, thick smoke and cloud cover obscured the city, prompting the B-29 bomber Boxcar to divert to its alternate target. Nagasaki, already damaged by earlier firebombing raids, was not an ideal candidate, but it still contained vital steel and arms production facilities. There's a cruel irony in the randomness of this selection. The fate of tens of thousands depended on weather conditions. Had Kokura been visible that day, it would have been destroyed instead. This detail underscores the terrifying unpredictability of atomic warfare, where strategic decisions intersected with chance, and entire cities hung in the balance based on cloud cover and flight plans. Why wasn't Tokyo chosen as the primary target, despite its central role in the Japanese government and military operations? The reasons were multifaceted. First, Tokyo had already suffered catastrophic damage from conventional bombing. In a single night in March 1945, during Operation Meeting House, American B-29 bombers dropped over 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs, destroying more than 40 square kilometers of the city. That firebombing killed an estimated 100,000 people, a death toll comparable to the atomic attacks, and left Tokyo in ruins. Targeting it again with an atomic bomb would not yield a clear demonstration of the new weapon's power. Moreover, U.S. officials worried that killing the entire Japanese leadership in one strike could paralyze any potential surrender negotiations, leading to chaos and resistance rather than capitulation. Another critical factor was Emperor Hirohito himself. Though a symbol rather than an active commander, he remained a spiritual and cultural anchor for the Japanese people. Eliminating him in a nuclear attack risked turning him into a martyr and intensifying national resolve, potentially triggering even more fierce and fanatical resistance. Lastly, there was a strategic consideration. Occupying forces would need a functioning government and infrastructure to facilitate reconstruction. Vaporizing Tokyo would complicate those efforts. For these reasons, the U.S. avoided making Tokyo a target for the atomic bomb, focusing instead on cities whose destruction would shock Japan into surrender without eliminating the possibility of diplomatic engagement. Kyoto was another city under serious consideration, and almost became the first victim of nuclear warfare. It was densely populated, home to significant industrial capacity, and held deep cultural and historical value as Japan's ancient capital. Strategically, it made sense. A single strike on Kyoto would not only cripple production, but also deliver a devastating psychological blow to the Japanese people. However, it was ultimately spared due to a combination of military pragmatism and personal sentiment. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited Kyoto before the war and admired its cultural richness, vehemently opposed its selection. He argued that destroying such a culturally significant city would permanently damage U.S.-Japan relations and inflame anti-American sentiment for generations. In his view, the long-term costs of targeting Kyoto far outweighed any short-term military gain. His opposition prevailed. Historians have since speculated that his personal memories of visiting Kyoto, possibly even during his honeymoon, played a role in shaping his passionate defense of the city. The decision illustrates how, even in wartime, individual human values and emotions can influence the course of history. If Kyoto had been destroyed, the psychological trauma might have pushed Japanese society further toward fanaticism, or, conversely, shattered their morale completely. That unknown consequence was not something Stimson or others were willing to risk. As a result, Kyoto was removed from the list of potential targets, replaced by other cities deemed suitable for displaying the bomb's true might. With Tokyo and Kyoto excluded, the final short list of targets included Hiroshima, Kokura, Yokohama, and Niigata. Hiroshima was ultimately selected as the primary target for the first atomic bomb due to its military significance and relatively untouched condition, making it an ideal city to observe and measure the bomb's effects. Its geography also helped maximize the destruction, with surrounding mountains containing the blast wave. Kokura was next in line, intended as the second target. But on August 9th, when the B-29 bomber Boxcar approached the city with the Fat Man bomb on board, a mixture of cloud cover and smoke from a nearby firebombing raid obscured visibility. Despite 3 attempts to find a clear opening, the bombardier could not visually confirm the target. A requirement for the mission. Running low on fuel and with no time to spare, the crew diverted to their secondary target, Nagasaki. That city, nestled among hills and valleys, was not ideal for maximizing the bomb's destructive range. Nonetheless, it suffered immense devastation. Over 40,000 people died instantly, with tens of thousands more succumbing to injuries and radiation-related illnesses. In a cruel twist of fate, Nagasaki's destruction was sealed not by strategic selection, but by weather. This last-minute redirection serves as a chilling reminder of how arbitrary the fate of entire cities could be, determined by clouds, fuel gauges, and split-second decisions made thousands of feet above the ground. The argument that atomic bombing was uniquely horrific is complicated by the fact that civilian populations had already been targeted repeatedly throughout the war. Conventional bombing raids across Europe and Asia had reduced countless cities to rubble. The Tokyo firebombing alone resulted in more casualties than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, with more than 100,000 killed in one night of incendiary bombing. In that context, some supporters of the atomic strikes argued that they were simply an extension of an already brutal form of warfare, one with the added benefit of ending the conflict quickly. However, others saw it differently. The instantaneous vaporization of entire communities, the long-term effects of radiation, and the targeting of all non-combatants elevated the atomic bombings to a new level of horror. The technology represented not just destruction, but annihilation. Survivors, known as hibakusha, would suffer radiation sickness, cancer, disfigurement, and psychological trauma for decades. Children were born with genetic mutations. Entire neighborhoods were wiped from existence. The bombings also introduced a new ethical dilemma. If humanity had developed the ability to erase cities with a single device, what would stop it from doing so again? Would this become the new standard of warfare? These questions haunted scientists, leaders, and citizens alike in the post-war world. The dawn of the nuclear age did not just end a war. It marked the beginning of an era defined by existential threat. Despite the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one must also consider what might have happened had Japan not surrendered. The U.S. was preparing additional atomic bombs, and the next one could have targeted Tokyo, a strike that might have decapitated the Japanese government and plunged the country into chaos. Some military leaders, however, doubted whether even another bomb would suffice to force an unconditional surrender. Japan's wartime doctrine emphasized honor, sacrifice, and death over defeat. The kamikaze pilots and suicide missions were only the most visible expression of this mindset. Japanese officers often chose death over capture, and civilians were frequently indoctrinated to believe that surrender was dishonorable. Had the war continued into a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Operation Downfall, the Allied plan for invasion, was divided into 2 phases. Operation Olympic targeting Kyushu in November 1945 and Operation Coronet aimed at Honshu in early 1946. Conservative estimates placed U.S. casualties between 250,000 and 1 million, with Japanese deaths possibly reaching several millions. The Japanese had trained civilians, including women and teenagers, to wield bamboo spears and Molotov cocktails. Every man, woman, and child was to become a soldier. Some Japanese leaders sincerely believed that if the entire population sacrificed itself, the Americans might reconsider total victory and allow for more favorable surrender terms. In this apocalyptic vision, death was not a deterrent. It was a strategy. This kind of extreme defiance wasn't entirely without precedent. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had chosen a similar path. By early 1944, many of Hitler's top generals knew the war was lost. Rationally, Germany could have negotiated a peace that preserved part of its territory and spared its people from catastrophic defeat. But Hitler refused. He knew that surrender would mean his own execution for war crimes, and so he ordered the country to fight until the bitter end. As a result, German cities were leveled, millions died, and the Soviet occupation brought a wave of destruction, especially in the East. The Allied leaders, having seen this in Europe, had little reason to believe Japan would act any differently. In fact, Japanese resistance was expected to be even more zealous. The kamikaze attacks and suicidal last stands of soldiers had already proven that the enemy was willing to sacrifice everything. Moreover, time was not a luxury the Allies could afford. The Soviet Union, having just declared war on Japan, was quickly advancing through Asia. There was a very real concern in Washington that if Japan didn't surrender immediately, the Soviets would seize parts of the Japanese mainland, leading to a divided post-war Japan much like Korea or Germany. From a geopolitical perspective, dropping the bombs ensured the U.S. alone would dictate the terms of peace and reconstruction. Ending the war swiftly was not only a military objective, it was a strategic race for influence in the emerging post-war order. Ultimately, President Truman faced an impossible decision. With millions of lives hanging in the balance, he had to choose between launching a brutal invasion, extending a war with no clear end, or using a weapon unlike any the world had seen. Historians still debate whether he fully understood the long-term implications of atomic warfare, but what is certain is that he was acutely aware of the human cost of delay. Intelligence suggested Japan was divided internally. Some leaders wanted peace, others wanted continued resistance. But even Truman's advisors believed that only a dramatic, undeniable show of force would shift the balance of power within Japan's ruling elite. Dropping not one but two atomic bombs in quick succession was intended to deliver that shock. It demonstrated to Japan and to the world that the U.S. had both the capacity and the will to end the war by any means necessary. It also gave ammunition to those within Japan's government who sought to justify surrender. They could point to overwhelming American power as a reason to end the war, without appearing weak or dishonorable. In this way, the bombings became more than just military acts. They became political tools, used by both sides to shift narratives, justify decisions, and shape the post-war landscape. For better or worse, they accomplished what months of fighting had not. They forced Japan to its knees. And yet, from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose a profound question, not just about warfare, but about humanity itself. Could the pursuit of victory ever justify such destruction? The world had entered a new age, one where entire cities could vanish in seconds and where a single decision could mean life or death for millions. But even in the face of that terrifying reality, there was resilience. Survivors rebuilt their lives. Japan, devastated and humbled, emerged from the ruins to become one of the world's leading economies and a staunch advocate for peace. In the decades that followed, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became powerful symbols, not only of tragedy, but of rebirth. The cities turned their scars into monuments, their grief into education, and their suffering into calls for nuclear disarmament. The bombings were a cataclysm, but they also became a turning point. They forced humanity to reckon with the cost of war, the limits of power, and the fragile nature of peace. In the end, the story of August 1945 is not just about destruction. It is also about what comes after, the courage to heal, to reflect, and to ensure that such horror never happens again. That is the legacy left behind by those who perished, and the responsibility inherited by those who remember. We've shared the story. Now, we'd like to hear from you. What's your take on the use of atomic bombs at the end of World War II? Do you believe it was justified, or could another path have led to peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps shape the conversation.